Okay, so now we're going to go into some definitions of dyslexia and kind of talk through some commonly used definitions and talk about some of the confusions that occur when we're talking about what is dyslexia and what is it not. So the first thing we'll talk about is that part of the problem with defining dyslexia or having one definition of dyslexia is that really it comes down to it being a spectrum disorder. There's a continuum of difficulty of reading problems. So a lot of it has to do with where a specific researcher or an organization is kind of drawing the line as far as, you know, do you have dyslexia if you're at the 10th percentile? Do you have dyslexia if you're at the 20th percentile? Do you have dyslexia if you're 1 standard deviation, 1.5 standard deviations? There really isn't ever going to be anything clear cut in that way. But what we do know is that while there's no universally accepted definition across organizations and researchers, there's commonalities across the definitions, and there's probably some really important things that need to be included in a definition of dyslexia. So Iowa has changed its definition of dyslexia very recently. So there was a law passed just a few weeks ago in June of 2020 that actually changed to a new definition of dyslexia. This on this slide is what was the previous definition of dyslexia. So previous to this June in Iowa code, it stated that dyslexia means a specific and significant impairment in the development of reading, including but not limited to phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, that is not solely accounted for by intellectual disability, sensory disability or impairment, or lack of appropriate instruction. So that's the definition that's existed for a while in Iowa code. And there's some issues with this older definition. The biggest problem being that it just lists the 5 areas of reading and really doesn't go very far in describing the nature of the difficulties. It kind of could be used to describe any basically reading problem that isn't due to another disability like a cognitive impairment or something like a visual impairment. So that the new law had advocated for a change in that definition. And that law was passed in June. So this is now our definition in Iowa of dyslexia in Iowa code. And it is the same definition that the International Dyslexia IDA uses. The IDA definition is the most referenced and the most widely used one. So this is what it says, and I want you to think about how this is different than what Iowa was previously using. A specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So you can see if you, I'll toggle back, if you look at this previous definition, how really generic it is, and that the new definition is much more clear about what components of reading are difficult for students who have dyslexia or a pattern of reading difficulties that matches dyslexia. And it kind of talks about primary characteristics and secondary characteristics, which I think is really helpful in knowing where the interventions in the problem lie. So just to kind of broaden our thinking a little bit, it's interesting to look across the world because we know dyslexia occurs in all languages, but it can present differently depending on the nature of the language. So in the Netherlands, this is their definition. Dyslexia is present when the automatization of word identification or word spelling does not develop or does so very incompletely or with great difficulty. The term automatization refers to the establishment of an automatic process. A process of this kind is characterized by a high level of speed and accuracy. It is carried out unconsciously, makes minimal demands on attention. It is difficult to suppress, ignore, or influence. The reason I think this is really interesting is because Dutch, like many other languages, is much more regular when it comes to the phonemes or the sounds in the language matching the graphemes or the orthography or the spelling patterns. So countries who have a much more regular match between phonology and orthography tend to see students who have more difficulty with fluency. They can accurately do the sounds. They can read the words accurately because of the sounds always match. But what they aren't able to do is get up to an automatic reading rate. It's still effortful, and so that's how it presents sometimes in other countries, which I think is really interesting. In Great Britain, this is what they use. It does talk about the origin of the word dyslexia. It comes from Greek and means difficulty with words. This is pretty similar to the IDA definition. So dyslexia is a specific learning difficulty which mainly affects the development of literacy and language-related skills. It is likely to be present at birth and to be lifelong in its effects. It's characterized by difficulties with phonological processing, rapid naming, working memory, processing speed, and the automatic development of skills that may not match up to an individual's other cognitive abilities. One other small thing to point out, both in the IDA definition and this one, it says may not match up to an individual's other cognitive abilities. One thing we know is that while many children with dyslexia have average to above average cognitive abilities, they don't all. So the old idea of if a child has a gap or a discrepancy between their IQ score, cognitive skills, and their reading skills, that must be dyslexia. And if their scores are similar, then it can't be dyslexia, has really been disproven. And it isn't something that we really look at. Often it is a surprising deficit that this child seems very able in other areas and is picking up lots of skills, but just isn't picking up reading. But it could also be that the child struggles in other areas and still has reading difficulties that match the characteristics of dyslexia. So we want to be careful with that. One thing that's also interesting to note is that across the country, the Decoding Dyslexia advocacy groups have really mobilized in this country to push forward lots of these changes that are happening right now in laws and code, and using the definition of being more explicit with instruction. Those same kind of groups have actually occurred in all English-speaking countries. So there's a lot of, I suppose, conflict right now in countries like Australia, New Zealand, and the UK around how do they teach reading, why don't so many of their children learn to read, are they recognizing dyslexia enough in schools, should they be doing certain interventions. So it isn't just in the United States right now that this kind of challenge is happening to our education system of why aren't kids learning to read. So this is from Nancy Mather, who's actually one of the authors of the book that you guys have in the class, that has some kind of really good consensus on the definition points. So any definition of dyslexia should probably talk about that it's a neurobiological disorder. It's something you are born with. It has to do with how your brain functions, that affects the development of basic reading skills, spelling, and automaticity. So basic reading skills, spelling, and automaticity with sound symbol connections. It is often accompanied by specific weaknesses in cognitive factors that predict poor reading and spelling. Those would be things like rapid automatic naming, phonological processing, processing speed perhaps. It is a lifelong condition, but effective interventions can hugely reduce or change the impact. So while it's lifelong, we know that we have a lot of power to change the course of reading development for kids with these difficulties, and that many other abilities are often intact and can even be advanced. So these are your kiddos who really struggle to read but are brilliant at building Legos and doing things on computers, and athletic and really good at math, and just it's often that the reading skill deficit is a surprising deficit. So a few other resources we wanted to share with you. This one is really important. in the PowerPoint, there's a link to this letter. It's a Dear Colleague letter from the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education. For a really long time, me included, we kind of had the idea that we should not use the word dyslexia in schools. In 2015, OSERS, the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, which is part of the Federal Department of Ed, released a letter that very clearly, very explicitly says that that is not true. In the letter, it talks a lot about that LEAs, so that's schools, and SEAs, so that would be like intermediate service areas like Grantwood or whatever, that there is nothing in IDEA, which is the law that created and maintains all the special education code, that prohibits the use of the term dyslexia. They even go on to talk about that dyslexia would be part of the specific learning disability category in IDEA, and that there's no reason that if dyslexia clearly describes the pattern of difficulties that a child has, and that using the term could help describe those patterns, identify those patterns, and match the child with appropriate intervention, that the term can't be used. It does also not require that the term be used, which can get really confusing, I think, in Iowa, where we are, if you didn't know this, as a school psychologist, I'm pretty aware of this, but we are the only state in the country that has non-categorical special education eligibility. So we don't have to state and decide that the student meets criteria for specific learning disability versus autism versus a behavior disorder versus a communication or language disorder. We can just say that they are eligible and say the areas that they are eligible in, which is very different than other states. So anytime you're looking at things that you Google or whatever that are more national, they're not going to reflect that Iowa kind of quirk in our system. I mean, I really think it's good because splitting kids into those discrete categories really doesn't make a lot of sense a lot of the time. But I think because we're non-categorical, we get very used to not really naming things like autism or behavior disorder or a specific learning disability. So often we get kind of in that trap of saying to parents, we don't use that term, we don't need to use that term, and really we're often coming from a place of like, of caring for not labeling the child, knowing that we just can still provide the intervention even if they don't have that label. But I will say that many parents hear that and they hear, you don't know what dyslexia is, you don't understand it, you don't know what to do about it. So I think we do have to be careful in all that conversation. So what I would say is that I'm going to show you a quote from the letter on the next slide that I think is critically important for everybody to read and understand. But if you are someone who's a special education teacher, probably a school administrator, or if you're an AEA person that's involved in Child Find, I would really encourage you to read the entire letter and then save that for your future reference if you're ever in a situation where you feel like maybe your school building or district isn't quite there yet with understanding the information in that letter. It would be something you could share with others, or you could reference in the future. So it is easy to Google. If you just Google Dear Colleague Dyslexia Letter, U.S. Department of Ed, it'll pop right up. So one quote from that letter, though, is this. Here. And it's of course written in kind of Federal Department of Ed language, but in implementing the IDEA requirements discussed above, OSERS encourages SEAs and LEAs to consider situations where it would be appropriate to use the terms dyslexia, dyscalculia, that's a hard one, or dysgraphia to describe and address the child's unique identified needs through evaluation, eligibility, and IEP documents. OSERS further encourages states to review their policies, procedures, and practices to ensure that they do not prohibit the use of the terms dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia in evaluations, eligibility, and IEP documents. Finally, in ensuring the provision of free, appropriate public education, OSERS encourages SEAs to remind their LEAs. Actually, SEAs is state education agencies. So in Iowa, we have AEAs. Everybody doesn't have those. SEAs to remind their LEAs of the importance of addressing the unique educational needs of children with specific learning disabilities resulting from dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia during IEP meetings and other meetings with parents under IDEA. So I think this is a big shift in thinking. I don't think anybody is at all saying, you know, as a teacher, you need to bring up the word dyslexia at parent-teacher conferences or anything like that. But we do need to start getting to be more the experts and feeling comfortable having those conversations and knowing when we can use that word and when it's appropriate to use that word. Another, I would say the two kind of urban myths that I think we are kind of coming out of, but one was we're not allowed to use dyslexia in schools. We're not allowed to say that word. The other is that dyslexia is a medical diagnosis. That's really an entrenched idea. I will just come right out and say dyslexia is not a medical diagnosis. Physicians don't even know how to diagnose dyslexia. It's not a medical diagnosis. It's a psychoeducational diagnosis. And just like any other learning disability. And while there are private clinicians like clinical psychologists and neuropsychologists who do, and they do a wonderful job of, many of them do a really great job of really digging into all the pieces of a comprehensive evaluation and providing parents with great information and great recommendations. Here's my concern with this whole thing of us pushing diagnosis of dyslexia outside of the school walls is that it is incredibly inequitable. So most private evaluations cost, depending on your insurance, anywhere from $500 or $600 to $1,500 to $2,000, and that's in Iowa. In other places, it's higher. So the idea that we would only recognize the characteristics of dyslexia and be able to have that conversation with parents and then teach the child the way that they need to be taught, if the only way we can do that is to have a $1,500 evaluation done outside of the school walls, we are excluding huge amounts of children whose parents will never afford that. So we really need to figure out, I think, two things. One is, how do we support parents that want to get that kind of evaluation? Because if they want to and they think it's useful and they want to know more about it, we should be able to help them navigate that. And your AEA people can help with that. But I think the idea that that's the only way we're going to be able to recognize this is crazy. So what we need to recognize is that as teachers and as educators, we're the ones that actually are responsible for teaching children to read. And this is a reading problem. So we really do need to be the experts in identification, diagnosis, and then treatment of dyslexia. So, we've had other parts of the class where we've talked about, do you even need to call it that at all? Because we know what good reading instruction looks like, and we know how to identify kids with phonological and word level reading deficits. Absolutely, that still completely stands. Of course, MTSS, RTI approaches completely stand. But we also do need to recognize that the idea that we would push all this off onto kind of a magical outside diagnosis, again, it's very inequitable. So one other thing is that if parents have the means and are able to go get an evaluation, we do want to give that all the credence and really look through and recognize all the information in those reports and review all the recommendations with the parents and take that pretty seriously. But I think what we don't want to do is have a two-tiered system where we have kids whose families can afford that and kids whose families cannot. So in this role of the physician, there's a link here. It's a letter, I think it's the American Association of Pediatrics. that really kind of talks through from a physician standpoint, what would be their role. And it really is to coordinate care and referrals as needed. And the other reason we wanted you guys to have this letter and the link to this letter, you don't necessarily have to read it unless you're super interested or having a hard time with the whole dyslexia. Is it a medical diagnosis? Who can talk about that? Is that there's quite a few sections in there about unproven therapies and approaches and how a physician should navigate that with a family. And there's quite a bit of information there about things like vision therapy. So if you ever had a parent or a family that asked you whether or not they should do something like vision therapy, obviously as an educator, you probably don't know much about that, but you could go to this link in this letter, and you could share the letter with them, and you could say, well, this is what I was, given at a training about vision therapy, and maybe you need to talk to your doctor and share this letter with them and ask that question. So there's a lot of things that parents might also spend a lot of money on that really aren't proven. So we want to make sure we support them with that. So I'm just going to say it one more time because we really hope that coming out of this class, that one of your shifts in thinking is really that dyslexia isn't a medical diagnosis. It isn't something external to school. It's really a problem that's primarily present in school, and that really elementary teachers, reading specialists, special education teachers, even middle and high school teachers, they're the ones who really are going to be at the front lines of identification and instruction and intervention with kids with these difficulties. So we'll revisit this, I think, when we're live, just to make sure if anyone has any pressing questions, because we know that some of this is probably a change in thinking from what maybe you've practiced